And we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody so much again for coming. Hopefully this is going to be informative and a good event. Thank you for your interest. My name is Talia, and I'm a member of Omaha Tenants United, and I'm Omaha's delegate to ATUN, which is the Autonomous Tenants Union Network. So for anybody not familiar with ATUN, we formally formed this October, and we're a national, international, actually, we've got a Canadian union as well, network of tenant unions that are organizing and coordinating nationally. So if you are a member of a tenant union and want to join ATUN, I'll post a link here, is our website. So there's more information. There's a calendar of events on there, as well as information to join if as a tenant union. And I'll also post the form here to join our mailing list as an individual. If you fill that one out, then you should be able to sign up and get information about upcoming events. And then in terms of some events that we have coming up, we put on a lot of educational stuff, trainings, town halls. So every month we have a town hall hosted by a different union. And the one this next month in February is going to be on onboarding and engaging members of your tenants union. So I'll post the link with more information about that as well. And I can post all this stuff at the end too. But with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John Pollock with the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Council.
Thank you. I'm going to just share my screen real fast. Great. Well, my name is John Pollock. I'm the coordinator of the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Council. I've been the coordinator since 2009. And it is just a pleasure to see so many people interested in this topic. I would love for my co-panelists to introduce themselves as well. So Caitlin and Pablo, would you mind introducing yourselves?
Okay, I'll go. Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Quackenbush. I'm an assistant director of policy and research at Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, SAGE, in Los Angeles, and a member of the Los Angeles Right to Council Coalition. And I'm really grateful to be here with you all and looking forward to learning from you and chatting more later.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pablo Estupiñan. I'm the co-director over at CASA in the Bronx, and also a member of the Right to Council New York City Steering Committee. And I'm excited to be here tonight, and my pronouns are he and him.
Thank you. And you'll be hearing from them very shortly about their incredible work in Los Angeles and New York City. What I'm going to do first basically is just talk a little bit about why we're here today and what is happening nationally to give you just the lay of the land. And then I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin and Pablo to talk about their great work. But we want you to be excited after today. There's a lot to be excited about on the Right to Council front, especially when you see how much has happened. We want to talk about the importance of coalition building and tenant leadership and how to work with attorneys if you're tenant organizers. That's a really important issue as tenant organizers and legal services programs come together on this work. What we are seeing really now is just a major groundswell of enthusiasm and interest on this issue. And I think the reasons why there are many, basically, that we have lots of data showing that council makes a huge difference. We know about the massive imbalance of power, where around 1% of tenants in many cities are represented compared to over 90% of landlords, a massive imbalance of power. And that power imbalance, of course, exists in other ways too, besides just in court. The way that achieving a right to counsel, especially when built through tenant action, empowers tenants. Increasing people's belief in the judicial system, which right now is at an all-time low. And avoiding the collateral consequences of evictions, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. They're just, basically when someone asks me, what are the consequences of eviction? My first thing I say is, what isn't a consequence of eviction? Almost everything bad that you can imagine. And I know for all of you working in this space, you know these things, that basically virtually every basic human need a person can have, whether it's not just their home, but their access to their children, their children's schools, their jobs, their health, all of these things are negatively impacted by evictions. And we know this from from decades of studies that have shown and quantified exactly how much damage evictions do. And then of course, cities and states lose money when they have lots of vacancies because of massive eviction turnover. This is just one estimate that was done about the cost of evictions nationwide, which put it at about $315 billion. And that's probably an underestimate because, as you can see here, they can only quantify certain kinds of things, shelter costs, medical costs, child welfare. There are other costs that are not easy to put dollar figures to and that have real cost to them too. And then during COVID-19, we have this problem of basically what happens to double up tenants, what happens to unhoused tenants. There have been several studies now showing statistically that evictions increase the spread of COVID and increase mortality during COVID. In fact, this study found that just increasing the eviction rate by 1% increased COVID spread by 5 to 10% higher and led to about 1 death for every 60 evictions. That just puts it really clear, like what we're dealing with right now. Evictions have always been a disaster, a crisis, a humanitarian crisis. And right now they are a matter of life and death. And then in addition to all of these other consequences, we have right now a very, very complicated legal picture, much more than even normally for eviction cases. We have federal and city and sometimes county and state moratoria on evictions that are sometimes getting repealed, sometimes being reintroduced, often being changed. The parameters of these moratoria are very variable. If you're a tenant in Seattle and you have a Seattle moratorium and a Washington state moratorium, you may not know which provision helps you with which part of that. Some moratoria prevent filings of evictions, some of them only prevent the sheriff's action. It really varies a lot. Expecting tenants to know what their rights are in this world that we live in during COVID is impossible. It's hard for even attorneys to keep up with all of these changes. And the CDC moratorium in particular, the federal moratorium, has a declaration requirement that tenants have to fill out to be covered at all. And the declaration is very complicated, subject to legal challenge. It has been challenged. Tenants are getting cross-examined in court about whether what they're saying in their declarations are true. The need for counsel, which has always been acute, is especially high during COVID. And lastly, whether or not eviction proceedings are held in person or by Zoom, either way, they present significant risks and due process problems. About 1/5 of all rural America doesn't have access to broadband internet or a smartphone device. And the remaining ones may not know how to use Zoom. They don't know how to introduce evidence on Zoom. They don't know how to cross-examine witnesses on Zoom. Calls are often dropped on Zoom. Some tenants are getting defaulted when they can't connect in the first place. This is a world in which these evictions should not be happening. And if they are going to happen, there needs to be counsel to ensure that these kinds of failures don't happen. And then from a race equity perspective, the Eviction Lab has shown that Black women especially are facing eviction at much higher rates than anyone else. And this is just a representative sample of some of those states. And the census, which started collecting data during the pandemic, what you see in this slide here, the top slide represents Black tenants and the bottom slide is white tenants. And the red bars indicate the likelihood of not being able to pay rent. So red is bad, essentially. And you can see those red bars are at about 40% for Black tenants. And if you look at the white tenants, they're down at about 20%. So white tenants are not feeling the impact of this crisis as nearly as much as Black tenants are. And that's true for Latinx tenants as well. This is just to give you a sense of just how bad this is. This quote from Ben Carson, which fortunately we don't have to deal with anymore. This was kind of like the lowest of the low point during the pandemic when he said this.
Well, eviction proceedings generally take about a year. They take a long period of time.
A year. So the head of HUD thought that evictions take a year. That's the world that we were dealing with last year. So where are we now? Fortunately, in a much better place. We have this national movement that's really taken hold. We have 7 cities that have already passed a right to counsel, which are listed here. We have a whole bunch that are on the way. We have 5 states already introduced, which are Nebraska, South Carolina, Washington State, Maryland, and Indiana. We are expecting legislation in several other states, as well as a few cities, possibly. So we are looking at a really big movement. This is all within the last 3 years. New York City really, and you'll hear from Pablo, really kicked off something nationally. Like it really set the stage for what is happening nationally. This is a very quick snapshot of like the basically parameters of all of these laws. And we don't have time to go through all of them. I just want to show you that They have different eligibility requirements. They cover different things. They, some of them were done by ballot initiative and some by city ordinance. The ballot initiative approach is a newly developing thing. 2 cities, San Francisco and Boulder, accomplished it that way. Denver is looking at doing it that way this year. We really encourage people to look at that, because if you have a recalcitrant city council, you can just basically bypass them entirely if your city has a ballot initiative process. The funding generally has been through general revenue of the city, but some of the jurisdictions have gotten a little more creative in how to look at funding. And then the implementation is how that's carried out is widely variable. My coalition does have model legislation on right to counsel we can share, but a lot of it is going to be has to be tweaked for each jurisdiction, because especially implementation, you really can't have just one standard that applies to everywhere. Pablo is going to talk extensively about New York. I'm just going to present a few stats, which is the number one stat: 86% of their tenants remaining in their homes. You can't really get much better than that. And what we really take a lot of stock into is the eviction filings dropping by 30%. That's a huge decrease in landlords going to court, which we expected, because landlords file a lot of frivolous lawsuits. And we knew that that would go down if tenants were systemically represented, and it has. And importantly, also the default rate, which in most cities is over 50%. 50% of tenants or more do not appear in eviction proceedings for very good reasons that we don't really have time to talk about right now. But the default rate has come way down in New York City, which is extremely important. And judges have testified that it actually is improving efficiency from their perspective. It's not making their jobs harder, which a lot of housing court judges are worried about. That's not our concern, because we're not worried about efficiency. We're worried about justice and equality. But the judges are worried about efficiency. So we have to address that as well. San Francisco also, in just a year, has seen a 10% decrease in the filing rate and about 2/3 of tenants staying in their homes. And what's really interesting is that even though it has no income limit, virtually everyone that's taking advantage of it is in fact the people we would expect. It's not being used by rich people. It's being used by the poorest of the poor primarily, and a few people that are at moderate income level. So that's what you would expect from that, what we would expect and what has actually carried out. And then we're just so happy, you know, these are cities where conversations have been happening about right to counsel. These are everywhere from like initial conversations to very close to introducing a bill. We're in contact with advocates, which are sometimes organizers, sometimes attorneys, sometimes actually city council members themselves, depending on the jurisdiction. But it just goes to show you the geographic spread of where people are talking. It's not just the East Coast and West Coast. It's starting to happen in the Midwest, in the South. You know, we're really seeing a lot of interest in this nationwide. There's a lot of data about how impactful counsel is. In the interest of time, I'm not really going to go through that right now, except to say that what we've seen in New York and San Francisco has been borne out in studies that were done before we even had a right to counsel anywhere. And what's really interesting is that it's not just about always just about keeping the tenant in their home. It's about things like in this study in Massachusetts, finding out how much tenants paid to their landlords. In the district court study, the represented group paid nothing to their landlords on average. The tenants who got assistance from a lawyer, but not to go to court, just sort of brief assistance, they paid over $600 to their landlords on average. So we saw the council makes an impact in many different kinds of ways in the proceeding. And in Minnesota, this really great stat that tenants who got counsel were 4 times less likely to use a homeless shelter. That's regardless of whether they stayed or not. So it's really, the impact is so variable of what an attorney can do. It's not just did they stay or did they go? There are many other legal questions that have to be answered. And there are cost benefits to these. We've done plenty of these studies now to know that investing in a right to counsel returns many, many dollars because of avoided shelter costs, avoided emergency medical costs, avoided foster care costs. We know this from the studies. We don't really feel like we have to keep doing these, but we have the studies to show that, you know, there are significant cost savings. And this statistic from Baltimore, from the same study, found that 80% of tenants who were surveyed actually had an available defense to their eviction, but only 8% actually were able to raise it without counsel, which just shows the untapped potential that's there for what lawyers can do if they're actually present, if we have the lawyers to actually evaluate these cases. Lots of cost that, you know, saving studies that have been done over the year in New York City and Philly and Los Angeles and Baltimore. Investing in right to counsel saves multiple times the dollars if you do it. And Massachusetts found basically that for every dollar they spent, they would save $2.69 on a variety of different costs that they spend right now because so many tenants are evicted. The last thing I want to say is just it's really important in thinking about right to counsel to also remember that the law itself is a limiting factor. Where the law is really bad, and it is really bad in many states, that addressing just cause evictions, addressing landlord licensing, addressing the amount of time tenants get before an eviction is filed, these things are extremely important also. Right to counsel in some ways is much more effective when the law is on our side, when it gives lawyers more things to do. When the law is poor, which is why we've seen some of the right to counsel efforts done in parallel with these other campaigns for things like just cause evictions and so on. And that right to counsel is really connected to emergency rental assistance, because tenants need counsel to apply for rental assistance. They need counsel to make sure a court does not try to evict them while they're trying to get rental assistance. And they need to ensure that if they have a right to pay the rent, the owed rent after the eviction's filed, that the landlord actually accepts it. Many landlords are at this point are going to refuse to accept rent money, even if they're offered it, because they just want the tenants out. If the tenants have a legal right to make the landlords accept that rent, they're going to need counsel to know that and to enforce that. And there's a lot of work being done right now to tap into federal stimulus money in a variety of sources. I don't have time to go into the details today, but just to say there's a lot we can talk to you about how to tap into some of these funds to access money to start getting, whether it's pilots, whether it's studies, whether it's, whatever, trying to get right to counsel off the ground in jurisdictions. And today is just the beginning as far as what we're going to be doing. We're going to be holding a webinar series, the National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel, in conjunction with the Right to Counsel of New York City. We're going to be holding a series over the next few months to feature jurisdictions that have passed a right to counsel in depth, giving one per session for everyone to ask questions about that jurisdiction, get really into the weeds to find out how they did it. And that will be leading to a convening of some sort this summer to get people together in a working session to say, okay, how can we do this in our jurisdictions? Like, how do we get our hands dirty? We have all this information on our website, the latest developments in an interactive map form. We keep track of all the legislation that's filed across the country, including all the housing bills. And you can see the status of the right to counsel as far as whether it exists on our website. We have a bibliography about everything that's ever been written about the right to counsel or the impact of counsel, and lots of resources there about what's been written about it. Our website has a way to stay informed about right to counsel. We have a newsletter, and the latest news is there. All of us, my panelists and myself, are all happy to be resources to you as you start exploring this in your jurisdictions. This is our contact information, which I'll leave up on the screen for just a little bit so people can see it. And now I want to turn it over to, I think Pablo's going to go first and really give us the organizer's view from New York City.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Hi again. I'm excited to be here with y'all and all the folks across the country working on being part of the Right to Counsel movement. So I wanted to start with one of the things I think was really instrumental to building a strong coalition and a campaign in New York City was that it was tenant-led. And so it all goes back to 2012 for us. CASA stands for Community Action for Safe Apartments. We're a tenants rights organization in the Bronx. We exclusively only organize in the Bronx. And we work with also organizing, the majority of our work is organizing tenant unions. And we are, in addition to right to counsel, we're a part of city and statewide campaigns. So that's a little bit about CASA and our work. And so, what I've appreciated being a CASA over the last 7 years is really being committed to having a grassroots membership-led model. And so back in 2012, this was before my time actually, the current coordinator of Right to Counsel in New York City, Susanna, used to be the director of CASA. And so she took it, she started working on the campaign. CASA had no campaigns at that point. So the first step that we did was identify what are the problems in the community. And in the Bronx, it's no surprise, right? The Bronx is mostly Black and brown folks with high rates of eviction, high rates of poverty, where we organize. It's the poorest urban congressional district in the country. And so many of our folks are one bad month away from being evicted and ending up in housing court. And to add on to those layers, half of people who live in the Bronx are rent burdened, right? So they pay more than 30% of their income towards rent. So it's tight for families. So we started to have meetings like, what are we going to campaign on? What are the issues? And our members, unilaterally said, housing court, right? They talked about knowing someone in housing court, knowing people being evicted. Some of our members have been evicted in the past, or experienced displacement from. Some of our members grew up in the Lower East Side, in Manhattan, got displaced, got evicted, so they moved to the Bronx, where it was a little bit more affordable. And so that's what our members saw as a problem, right? Housing court. Every day in Bronx housing court before the pandemic, over 2,000 people went in to hear their cases, their eviction cases. And the thing that's unique about New York City is we have a unified housing court system that was actually the result of tenant organizing win in the 70s. Housing court was established in New York City in 1974 as a part of civil court, where tenants could take their landlords to court for repairs, right? And get services, stop harassment. But that's not the history of housing court, right? It was supposed to be a tool for tenants to hold their landlords accountable. And what it instead turned into was an eviction mill, an eviction machine, right? Churning out 2,000 cases. John showed you the stats in 2013 were less than 10, it was like 3% of folks were represented or something. And to us, that was about power, right? We know that evictions are violent. Evictions shouldn't really happen. But to John's point about the case filings dropping, it was really about power, right? And it costs landlords less than $50 to file cases. And so our members identified housing court as a problem for us, and we want to find out more about it. So then we spent a year developing the campaign. Our members did observations in housing courts. They went inside, they observed the behavior of the judges, how judges treated tenants without attorneys, how they gave so much leniency to landlord attorneys, right? We know that if you don't show up to court, you default, right? As a tenant, you lose your case, you can get evicted. In housing court in the Bronx, the judge will call the landlord attorney and be like, hey, come to this courtroom, or else, so they don't default. So there's a power imbalance in housing court. And so those were all observations as a result of a bunch of surveys we did, which led to the publication of a report that we put out, that CASA put out in 2013, called The Burden, Tipping the Scales. Whoops. Yeah, it's Tipping the Scales. I can drop it. It's on our website, but in there, there's like over 20 policy recommendations about housing court, right? How to shift the power from landlords wielding it over tenants back to tenants using housing court as a place of justice and holding their landlords accountable. And one of the key things was right to counsel, right? That was one of the key things. Like if everyone has an attorney, it will change the balance of power. And at that time in 2013, I'll be honest with y'all, some of the attorneys that we worked with or had close relationships with kind of laughed at our members. They were like, it's never going to happen. We have been trying for decades. But I think the good lesson in looking back at the campaign is that it was really member driven, right? And I think in organizing, often what our community members face is that they're told that they're not smart enough, they're too dumb to understand housing court or rezonings or whatever, right? So I think what we really did was gave our members the tools to learn housing court, go observe, help us create the surveys that they administered to people at housing court. And so they were really involved in every step. And that's before that was a year's worth of work before CASA founded the Right to Counsel Coalition in 2014. So I think through developing a campaign with members, a lot of our leaders really had a strong ownership of the campaign. And so when we established the Right to Counsel New York City Coalition in 2014, that principle was easy, right? There wasn't a negotiating. It's clear it's going to be that the model of this coalition is going to be tenant-led. And yeah, we're going to join forces with other housing advocates, other housing tenant attorneys, and that's who the Right to Counsel Coalition is. And so really the goal of Right to Counsel, as y'all know, in New York City in 2017, we became the first city in the country to have a right to counsel. And that was significant. And it was quite a fight. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about two things: about the need for coalition building, the diverse coalition led by members, and I think I think the principles of having strong legislation. As John said, there's legislation that y'all can be shared with, But one of the key things that we wanted to fight for in Right to Counsel was to make it for everyone, right? And so we wrote strong legislation, but there was some negotiations, right? Back and forth between council members and the city. And the principle is really for everyone, right? It's folks who are being taken to housing court, or, there's also, if you live in NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority projects, you don't get taken to housing court, you get taken to an administrative hearing. And so that was one of the points of contention, that the city didn't want to make it something for everyone, right? That they were willing to leave NYCHA residents out of it. And that is something that we really fought hard for, to the point where we kind of said to the city, if you don't include NYCHA, then we don't want this Right to Counsel, because it's not a real version that's for everyone. And so where we landed at, as y'all saw, was the city ultimately, this was actually came from the city, was they decided to do a 5-year phase-in plan by rolling out Right to Counsel in zip codes. And there is an income requirement in New York City. It is about 200% of the federal poverty level. But in our analysis, essentially, like as John already mentioned, it's mostly low income Black and brown folks who are taken to court, right? So the majority of folks in our analysis would qualify for Right to Counsel. And then going back to the need for coalition building, y'all can feel free to ask questions if you have any so far, and about it, but there's a lot of organizing work to do, right? So I think the coalition is successful because there's different working groups that were developed. One is an organizing working group, and that's the central space where tenant leaders make decisions about, what's in the legislation, what are our actions, what are our tactics, what's our strategies. There's a tenant attorney working group as well, that was formed within the coalition, and that was talking about implementation, right? The nitty gritty, how will, because essentially with Right to Counsel, once you establish Right to Counsel, that's one fight. The whole other fight is implementation, right? Because it can be poorly done. And so that was another critical piece that we did, was creating a working group for tenant attorneys to figure out what is the best model, right? How do people get notified that they know they have their right to an attorney? How are tenant attorneys sharing strategies with each other for defenses, to raise the best possible defenses and represent clients well? Or even in housing courts, y'all, most people's evictions got settled in the hallway, right? Where they were up against the landlord's attorney in the hallway, where everyone can see, and they had to sign a piece of paper saying a stipulation saying, I will, I agree to pay, 3 months worth of rent by this date. And if they don't meet that, they get evicted, right? So that was a whole other key thing, is there is no privacy or confidentiality. Literally, people are fighting for the future of their homes, and it's it's something that is witnessed by everyone in the hallways within the courts. And I don't know if y'all, I imagine a lot of y'all have gone to courts to observe this process. And if you haven't, I really recommend it. Before the pandemic, we used to do tours for, elected officials or allies who were visiting a Bronx housing court, and everyone was shocked at the spectacle of housing court and Black and brown folks being lined up for eviction. So that's something key that the coalition did, was, create a space for leaders to make all the decisions on the campaign, create a space, working group to empower tenant attorneys to also figure out how it's going to actually function, how they're going to represent clients, and this speediness of the court. And the other thing is ramping up, right? There's also a tenant attorney pipeline working group that the coalition created, because in creating a system overnight, you need attorneys, right? So this whole pipeline working group is its job is to go to to do outreach, to get folks interested in creating and being a part of this movement, right? Because I think that's in creating a new system, we're also creating all these laws, right? So I mean, we're creating there's a lot of jobs that are basically being created, and part of our goal is to create movement lawyers, right? So that's a lot of essential work that Right to Counsel also does, is going, because one thing that we fought for was to make sure that nonprofit legal service providers were the ones representing tenants, And so the coalition has also done a lot of trainings. Our community members have shared their experiences or not great experiences with attorneys in terms of building, like, how can we have a community lawyering model? Because the other unique thing about, I don't say unique thing, but as y'all saw, people often don't raise their defenses, right? So people can raise defenses in New York City around, I don't have repairs, or I need heat or hot water, and that stuff usually gets ignored by the judge, right? And so that's important for folks to know. And on our end, as a result of, so New York City is doing a couple things. They've obviously committed to right to counsel. It's in the budget. It's not something we're fighting for year after year. It's in there, it's cemented. Right to counsel will exist. That was also part of the fight. It was also making sure it was a permanent part of the budget and not something we negotiate for over every year. But New York City, in addition, has also funded legal service providers to do affirmative work. And so part of us organizing tenant unions also means that not only can we tell our members that, we can help protect you from eviction and you will have an attorney automatically, but there's attorneys that you can work with, that you can organize your tenant unions with, and proactively sue your landlord for repairs, for harassment or heat and hot water. Sorry, there's a lot of comments. Just making sure I don't miss any questions. Cool. And then I think that was part of what was helpful. The campaign took almost 4 years, and I wanted to share with y'all a link to our documentary that we released, that we premiered last year. It was really last month. But y'all know this pandemic is really dragging. So I dropped in the chat the link to the documentary. You can watch it. It's about 50 minutes. It's awesome. It will cover some of the things we said, some of the organizing work we did. And we did have to create a coalition citywide, right? We expanded from, once CASA founded the New York City Right to Counsel New York City Coalition, we had to go do outreach. We had to go get other tenant organizations on board. And so in the documentary, you'll see the different tactics that folks did. We did town halls. We went to every community board and did presentations similar to John's on the benefits of right to counsel. Like our members did a lot of work. There was so many meetings with elected officials. There's 51 New York City Council members. They all supported, the community boards were generally supportive and, passed resolutions in favor of right to counsel. And then the real obstacle we faced was the question about money, right? The budget. So working with Stout was really helpful for us to produce that report that demonstrated that New York City would save $320 million. And after that, the mayor really we had enough council members that it was veto proof. So we got them, right? So we got them right where they wanted, where they couldn't say, and even the landlord lobby didn't oppose it, right? Because they all have attorneys when they're in housing court. So that's a little bit about what I wanted to share, and just open it up for a bit if y'all have questions before we move next to Caitlin and their fight in LA.
Pablo, can you just say a quick word about like resistance you got from, I know that there was skepticism within the legal aid community about what could be achieved, can you sort of talk a little bit about that? Because that's a really important point in terms of trying to, when you're getting attorneys and organizers to work together as far as what they see as possible.
Yeah, again, I think it takes a lot of organizing work beyond the coalition spaces. There's also the relationship building is really important, right? I think we identified strong partners and movement lawyers, right? Folks that we knew were down, understood organizing principles, understood that we always put our members first to make decisions. Because if you think about it, in the role of an attorney, they're often the ones in the position of power to let folks know there's that power that attorneys have, right? And then when they ask, their clients that they're representing, sometimes it's like, I think you should do this because this is the best deal you're going to get. And so I think there's some organizing work to do there to shift the framing of what representation looks like, what empowering representation looks like for community members. But also for us, it was who are really our strong allies in the nonprofits and legal service providers that understand our organizing model and will hold it down. And in turn, they also, kind of function as organizers, right? To go back to the nonprofit legal service providers and have those conversations about representation, making sure that we were on board with the coalition, the vision was in alignment. And so we did, it did take a while to get everyone, because the coalition is made up of almost 40 different organizations, including a lot of legal service providers. So it does take time to build relationships, do one-on-ones, invite folks to the meeting spaces and really see, I think it takes some time, right? Because we weren't exactly working hand in hand, because there weren't really a lot of attorneys before 2012. So that was important. Aspect of our work in the coalition building is also relationship building, right? And I think the other thing is I'm happy to share any resources that we can make available to y'all. I think having the structure of Right to Counsel in New York City is a steering committee. So it is made up of organizers, some tenant leaders and attorneys. And so there are having a clear structure, having a clear decision-making process is also really helpful to make sure that everyone is in alignment and that we're working towards the same vision, right? So, because you all know there's always a possibility of while we all endorse the Right to Counsel bill, sometimes there's side conversations, right? Elected officials will call different people. They don't tend to call us, but they do tend to call legal aid organizations to be like, hey, what do you think about this bill? So it's important that you have great partners that really support your position and the legislation fully. Also, because they're, if you all decide to work with legal service providers, they're going to be the ones also directly talking to the city in the future about the implementation, contracts, all of that stuff, right? And that's not really our lane as organizers. So building that solidarity is super important. I see Joe has a question about, for places that don't have a separate housing eviction court, do you feel that's a benefit, or do the dangers outweigh the positives? I'm not exactly sure, because I'm only familiar with New York City housing courts. Maybe other folks could chime in about that.
I know that our experience with it is it's neither automatically a positive or a negative. It really depends on the place. We've heard in some places the housing courts are worse than the general courts of general jurisdiction. Maybe because in some of the housing courts, the judges do have to do housing court as like they're part of their initial cycle when they're first getting on the bench and they don't like it. And so you find the judges there that are like the least wanting to be there when it's an isolated court. I don't know if that's the reason in all places, but in some places we've heard that to be true.
I guess it might also depend on if the eviction case is a summary proceeding. I'm beyond my expertise here, but I understand how in New York City housing court cases move quicker than other kinds of cases. So I think that might be another factor, is how quickly eviction cases move where you live in the local court.
So I think we should turn to Caitlin to give her a chance to go over LA, which is has been working really hard to try to get there. So Caitlin, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. Hey, everyone. As I said already, I'm with Strategic Actions for a Just Economy in Los Angeles. And just a quick note about SAGE, we're a community-based organization in South Central, where we've been organizing for tenant rights and building tenant power since the late 90s, and we focus on housing and economic justice issues. And SAGE is a proud member of the Los Angeles Right to Counsel Coalition. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you all today. It's also really amazing to be here with both Pablo and John, two people and respective organizations we've learned so much from in Los Angeles. And also awesome to be here with Atune, of course. I just want to note that I think there are many members of the Los Angeles Tenants Union who are part of the Right to Counsel Coalition on this call. So I invite you all to chime in and add here because we're all reps of the Los Angeles work, of course. So I just want to kick off with a little bit of history about the Right to Counsel Coalition, and then I'll talk about what we've won so far and where we are headed in our ongoing fight to win a permanent right to counsel for tenants in LA. So first, the Los Angeles Right to Counsel Coalition is made up of tenants, tenant organizing groups, including Los Angeles Tenants Union and SAGE and others, academics, and nonprofit legal service organizations. And we formed as a coalition back in 2018 to call for the renters' right to counsel for tenants facing eviction, including full scope legal representation, eviction prevention services such as outreach and education, and emergency rental assistance. Back in 2018, we were inspired by the victories of New York and San Francisco, where they successfully fought for and won this right. So we came together really quickly in LA to push for this codified right locally as well. But, I say that, and at the same time, tenant right to counsel was not a new idea to Los Angeles and to tenant rights organizers and advocates. Generally, tenant leaders and legal service providers, advocates have been talking about the gross power imbalance in eviction proceedings and in the court for a really long time. And just as an example, tenant leaders at SAGE brought up the need for free legal representation and talked about a right to counsel as a campaign priority for us as an organization way back in 2017. So it's just a little bit about how we formed. Throughout 2018 and 2019, we built this campaign for a right to counsel. And then we worked really closely with key allies and champions that were identified at both the city and county level to develop a concrete policy proposal for a multi-year phase-in of this guaranteed right to counsel that would also include tenant outreach and education and emergency rental assistance for all tenants at 80% AMI or below, which in LA County is about $90K for a family of 4. And we definitely learned a lot from New York for our geographical phase-in model. And back in 2019, we won a commitment for phase 1 of an eviction prevention and defense program in the county with upwards of $14 million allocated. And then the county also committed to considering a right to counsel ordinance following the implementation of phase 1 of this program. The city of Los Angeles then followed suit and committed about $7 million for this phase 1. Then we were in early 2020, we were literally, dotting the I's and crossing the T's on this massive contract with the county to implement this first phase and work towards the codified right when COVID-19 hit and the shutdown orders followed. And basically, at that point, the county came to us and they said they couldn't commit to this multi-million-dollar contract we'd been negotiating for months, and that they were worried about budget shortfalls, but they were also worried about COVID-19's impact on tenants and the impending eviction crisis. They were like, what can you all propose to us? What can we do that will be countywide? So no longer a phase in by geography. We gotta support everyone. What can you do that's countywide, that's going to address this impending eviction crisis, and can you do it with only $2 million? And so we came together quickly and put our heads together, worked with our base, and developed a program proposal, which is now called the Stay Housed LA County Program. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to that website. So we have been implementing this program since April 2020 now. And over the course of our organizing and advocacy, we've also been able to expand this program. So as of now, it's a $14+ million program in partnership with the County of Los Angeles and tenant-led community organizations and legal service providers. And specifically, Stay Housed provides public awareness, so informing tenants about their rights through mass digital ads and media stories, targeted outreach and education through phone and text banking and virtual Know Your Rights workshops, and then a whole process for like bringing tenants into an organizing home based on their geography and where they are. We'll connect them with the various tenant rights organizing groups, whether that's SAGE or ACE in South LA, or a tenant union local in Hollywood, or I know Eastside is on the line tonight over in East LA. So we'll be connecting folks with that organizing home. And then it also includes legal services. So that's full scope eviction representation, although as we know in this current moment, that's looking a little bit different given the various sort of patchwork eviction protections that are in place right now because of COVID. But it also includes active defense against landlord harassment, written pleadings to prevent eviction, and holistic legal assessments on issues such as benefits and unemployment, domestic violence, and immigration. And then most recently, through our organizing and advocacy efforts, we've won some additional funding and support from the city of Los Angeles. And so we're working on expanding again and connecting the city and county on this program. I'll just pause because I think it's useful for this group and for this conversation in particular, just to share a little bit about our process and infrastructure. So the Right to Counsel Coalition oversees the implementation of the Stay Housed LA program and the ongoing campaign for a codified right, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the Stay Housed LA program includes a Right to Counsel Coalition steering committee, which is responsible for ensuring that the program remains accountable to the coalition principles and values and the tenant base, and our tenant leader steering committee. And the steering committee includes membership of all the contracted organizations implementing this program, as well as at-large members such as the LA Tenants Union, which isn't a subcontractor, but is part of the leadership and accountability space for this program overall in the county. So all that said, I don't want to minimize in any way. Stay Housed LA is a significant victory, and it's providing, material benefits to tenants right now that are urgently needed in this moment of cumulative crisis due to the pandemic and job loss and housing insecurity. And yet, as a coalition, our fight continues. So now I'm going to talk about what we're fighting for as a coalition and our ongoing campaign work real quick. Let me just check. Yeah. So, I'll just reiterate a few data points that John shared up top. We in Los Angeles, we also know that 90% of tenants face eviction without legal representation, while almost 100% of Los Angeles landlords file evictions and go to court with legal representation. And this gross power imbalance, as we've been talking about this evening, really matters. It matters because when tenants are not represented, they almost always lose, even if they have a valid legal defense. It matters because when tenants are represented, they almost always win and stay in their homes. And New York proves this point, and so much of what John and Pablo have already discussed. Landlords are able to evict tenants because they have the resources to do so, not because the law supports them. And tenants are evicted because of a lack of resources and an imbalance of power, not because they don't have a valid or legal right to stay in their home. So, I know you all know this, and all of this is to say this is why we are continuing our fight for, codifying the right to counsel through an ordinance locally. We want this to be a guarantee tenant right for free legal representation for all low-income tenants facing eviction. And yet, as I've kind of already alluded to a few times, in LA, when we say right to counsel and what we're fighting for in terms of a guaranteed right and a policy, is not limited to the legal representation aspect of this. We are also centering the goals of building tenant power and strengthening the tenant movement for the long term. So we want our policy to include resources and capacity for outreach, education, tenant organizing, with the goal of reaching, as many tenants as possible as early on and preventing evictions from happening in the first place. And of course, always continuing to build that base of tenant power. So just sort of big picture, as a coalition, sort of long term, we aim for, a true mass movement of tenants that commands the human right to housing. And in a policy for right to counsel, we aim for a guaranteed right to counsel codified into law, both at the city and county level, a fully resourced and permanent source of funding for outreach, education, and eviction prevention. That results in the eradication of evictions from LA and accelerates right to counsel in California and beyond. That's our ambitious goal. How am I doing on time? Am I okay to keep going?
You're good.
Cool. So I want to pause and ask this question that we get all the time, which is, this all sounds great. How is this different than an eviction defense program? Or how is this different from the Stay Housed LA program I talked about at the top? That's a question we get from local elected leaders all the time. And, it's different because tenants need a guaranteed right, not a program with a contract that we have to fight to extend every 6 months and constantly search for funding streams. Right to counsel, as John and Pablo have already shared, should be a true tenant right, codified through an ordinance. And LA should be on that list that John shared with all the jurisdictions with these guaranteed laws. It should be a true tenant right because a right is less vulnerable to attacks and ebbs and flows of political support and budget cycles. It should be a true tenant right because we need a long-term commitment to fight this eviction crisis. The eviction crisis was with us before the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's going to be with us long after. There's a COVID, long after we're through this current moment. But everything I'm about to say here, I've learned from working with community members at SAGE, working with our coalition partners, and then also learned from the New York's work and organizing work across this country. This must be a true tenant right because a right fundamentally shifts power to the right holder, and tenants gain power specifically in this through eviction proceedings by correcting that gross power imbalance. But tenants also gain power through the knowledge that, our interests will be protected if brought to court. And tenants gain power because we know that we can rightfully stand firm and organize against harassment and threats and build tenant associations and assert our rights in our homes and communities if we need to. And then we can assert and defend those rights in court. We say this all the time, tenants, we must have rights, we have to know our rights, and we have to be able to defend those rights with a codified right to counsel. So that's what we believe. Those are, I just outlined sort of our campaign objectives and sort of what that looks like in terms of a policy. And then I'll just add, we're all living through the cumulative impacts of the global pandemic and the way it's impacting the most vulnerable in our community right now. And I'm sure, everyone on this call knows that housing security and preventing evictions has always been a matter of health, but that fact is even more evident right in this moment when housing is literally the cure and evictions equal death. And then, specifically in California, our elected leaders have yet to pass a comprehensive rent cancellation program or any true eviction moratorium that would actually secure housing, keep people safe, and curb the spread of this virus. All of the patchwork protections that exist right now really only give tenants an affirmative defense and ultimately rely on the courts for enforcement. And while that's incredibly frustrating, it also underlines the need for a codified right to counsel and makes it even more pressing in this moment. Let's see, I just want to share a couple of things. So just where we are right now in the campaign. So, we're several years in, we've launched this big program, but we are focused this year in 2021 on codifying the right. And we actually seek to pass an LA County board motion calling for a codified right to counsel through an ordinance by late spring of this year. That's our ambitious campaign goal. And then we believe the city of Los Angeles will follow suit sometime in the summer. But in order to do so, we of course need to continue building our base, empowering our tenant leader steering committee and all the work that they do. We need to analyze and lift up the evidence that the Stay Housed LA program provides us on the positive impact of outreach, education, and eviction defense services. And we need to hold our electeds accountable and put their feet to the fire, particularly in this moment. It's been, like I said, many years now, and Los Angeles really needs to be part of this national movement. We need to be leaders alongside New York and San Francisco and Baltimore and Cleveland and Omaha and the whole state of Nebraska and so many, many, many more. And many of you who are here tonight. So I think I'll stop there. I'm really happy to answer questions. I'm going to drop a couple resources in the chat. You can learn more about Los Angeles's effort and the Right to Counsel Coalition by following us at RTC Los Angeles on all the social media platforms. You can check out our website, of course. And then if you're in the LA area, first, of course, connect with your local tenant union, and then drop your info in this RTC contact form, and we'll reach out to you about this ongoing campaign and the various sort of actions and ways that you can support and be a part of this movement. Okay, I have not been following the chat. That's the end of my sort of spiel part of this. So I'm gonna pause and check out what's in the chat and take any questions y'all have.
And Caitlin, I've been answering, and Pablo as well, we've been answering ones while you've been talking. So you should definitely feel free to scroll through and see if you have additional things to say about what we said. One of the things I want to mention sort of as we get towards the close here is that there was some discussion in the chat about triage. And I think this is really important about right to counsel, because we often get asked, what does a right to counsel actually mean? And I can tell you what we mean when we say a right to counsel, which is that an attorney for a tenant does that which is necessary to get full justice in the case without regard to resource. That is the idea. In some cases, that's going to mean fully litigating the case. In some cases, that's going to be negotiating with the landlord. In some cases, that's going to mean it's going to mean doing work outside of the courtroom. But the attorneys right now often make that choice, not because they necessarily think it's the best thing, but because they cannot do any more with what they're given. The legal services programs have to turn away half the people that they get. The people that they do get, they're severely under-resourced. They cannot do everything for them that they might choose to do. That's the world we're trying to change with right to counsel. We're trying to say this, and that's why the fight for resources and the funding is so important. And as you're thinking about costs in your jurisdiction, whatever you think the number is, just like add like 20% to it, because the chances are it's going to be more expensive than you think, and you don't want to get into a situation where you have the right and it doesn't have enough money, and then you're trying to fight to get more, because that probably will happen anyway, but you don't want to start off there. And most of the rights to counsel, I know in San Francisco, the original estimate was, I think, around 6 million, and they're now up at around 10 for the actual cost of it. So like these are things we're learning a lot from that about how to make sure that these estimates are very conservative, so that we make sure that attorneys really can provide a right to counsel and are not back in the triage model where they're not doing everything that they feel they need to do for a case.
I'll just add, Los Angeles, we were fortunate enough to also work with Stout on the cost benefit analysis. Was and continues to be so critical in the conversations we have with local leaders who, of course, the first thing they ask is, how are you going to pay for this? And that's why we're trying to kind of shift the narrative a little bit and help them think longer term, which they're not always great at doing, right? But helping them to think about the long term cost savings when you empower tenants and you have due process and equal protection under the law, how much money you're going to save on the cost of housing crises, and the sort of way it impacts education and jobs and trauma and mental health and physical health and all those things. So that's been super important in our conversations with the city and county. And interestingly, recently, because of the launch of the Stay Housed LA program, we're getting less pushback on the funding and more pushback on, well, what's the difference between this program and what you're asking for with the codified right? That's where our challenge is, and that's where we're going to be pushing.
There was also a question about whether legal aid organizations fight right to counsel. I can actually tell you, when I started 11 years ago, there wasn't necessarily as much buy-in for right to counsel, even from legal aid organizations. I think the world has really changed in the last decade. Legal services programs have been huge supporters of right to counsel in almost every jurisdiction we work in. It's rare that we run into one that is not fully supportive of it. And I would say that they're fully supportive of it, even if they're not ultimately the ones that get the contract to do the work, although they usually are, because they're the ones who are already doing eviction defense in those jurisdictions. So why would you create another org to do something legal aid already knows how to do? But even where they haven't necessarily been included in a contract, they still are fully supportive of it and they believe it needs to happen. It's rare where we run into a program that doesn't want to see that.
One other,
someone asked, oh, go ahead, Caitlin.
I saw some things in the chat about LSC funding and the limitations for undocumented tenants. And I just wanted to share how we're getting around that issue in LA. So, and part of the benefit of having this really large collective of many of the nonprofit legal service organizations, as well as all the tenant rights community-based organizations, is that we've able to, through the Stay Housed LA program, we're able to design the referral process so that tenants are referred appropriately to the organizations that we have locally that are not restricted through LSC funding and can represent undocumented tenants. So no one is turned away through both the program and then what we would propose for expanding this through a codified right in the future based on documentation status. But we're able to do that because we've built these trusted partnerships, and we have this collected effort that includes many different organizations with different funding models that allow us to do that.
Someone asked about the relationship to Stout. They started doing this work originally all pro bono, and then they're like a giant financial analysis company out of New York, and they have offices all across the country, and they did the work in New York City pro bono, and then they wound up doing a couple of the other ones pro bono, and then they kind of hit the wall doing it all for free. But they really want to see this happen. So they've been working with the jurisdictions to try to negotiate like a rate that places can actually afford to pay, and helping try to figure out how to get money to pay for it. They are, they really are an ally in this work. If folks want to work with them, I would say that, like, because they do require some funding to get, you need to have kind of a serious interest in really doing it. And the Stout study takes can take up to 6 months for them to do their work, to gather all the data that they need to produce the kind of report that they want to produce. Sometimes they'll do a shorter, more limited one if a jurisdiction needs that. They are flexible. If you're interested in working with them, reach out to me. I'm happy to, make that connection with them. But they are really interested. And I'm going to put in the chat also, but the first webinar in our new series will be on February 4th at 3 Eastern. I'm going to put the registration link in the chat. The first one will be similar to this session except it will not be about any specific jurisdiction. It will dive more into the structural way of thinking about right to counsel. And then every session after that will be a specific jurisdiction for an hour. I still think, even though you've gotten this session today, you'll still find value in the session on the 4th. It will be somewhat different. So I'm going to send the registration link in the chat, and I would love it if you could join us. There it is. Does anyone have any other questions that I hope we got to everyone's question in the chat. If we didn't answer it, it's not because we didn't think it was important. It was just because we missed it. They were going fast. If anyone didn't get their question answered, please let us know.
And for anyone who wasn't here at the beginning, I'll post some information about Atun, again, the Autonomous Tenants Union Network. So we're really happy to host this event and get this information out to folks. I think we have a little bit more time for questions if people do still want to, but I'll post that.
I did put the link to the slides in the chat from tonight. So you can, anyone who wants the slides, I know I went very fast and there was a lot of numbers in them. So those slides are linked. Oh, someone wants the link to that again. Yes, I will post the link to the Dropbox again, where the slides are. In just a moment. It is now in the chat now. So you don't have to scroll back to find them. And yeah, you know, my organization is a resource to anyone who wants to work with us. I've worked with a number of you on this call, and for anyone we haven't worked with, we're really excited to do it. And Caitlin and Pablo have said they're willing to answer questions too. One of the big things we do is connect people to other jurisdictions that are similar to theirs so that they can swap notes about what's realistic for their cities or states compared to other places that are like theirs. So we're happy to make those connections. Someone asked if we've worked with Dallas. We have not worked with Dallas. We have worked in Houston, San Antonio. We've had some conversations in Austin, but not Dallas. So, in my email address is, someone asked, I'll put it in the chat here. It's in the chat. Caitlin and Pablo, if you want to drop yours in the chat, again, just so people have it, easy access to it, that would be great. It was in the slide, but again, that went fast. Organizing on right to counsel is a racial justice issue. Pablo or Caitlin, do you want to take that question?
No, Pablo, go first, and I'll jump in.
Yeah, when that question, what resonates with me or comes up for me in that question is around messaging. And that was definitely how we, publicly talked about it and how our members see it. I think John demonstrated earlier that the impact is mostly on Black folks who have the highest rates of evictions. And so we also, we saw all these things as tied. That evictions are definitely about race. It is a racial justice issue. It's an economic justice issue. In the Bronx, a lot of at risk of eviction are single Black mothers. So there's also that component about, about what it means for, the violence of evictions and tearing families apart that's been well documented. So to me, it's definitely a question about messaging, right? Like what we're broadcasting to the world about why right to counsel is fundamental. And although we didn't dive so deep into it, I think during our campaign, it was about shifting that power, that balance of power. And, for the Bronx and its legacy of redlining and, where we organized 80% of the neighborhood burnt down in the 80s, there is like these deep layers of, in this history. So definitely tie into the messaging is, I think, really critical. And it totally blew my mind that I didn't mention this, but part of the coalition building was also getting support with unions and interfaith, right, faith leaders. So there was just broad support around right to counsel. And yeah, you want to go ahead, Caitlin?
Sure. I mean, just second all the points that you're making, and we know from both all the data and all the research has been done on how eviction happens, but also from just the lived experience of organizing and working with tenants in South Central Los Angeles for decades, that eviction impacts Black women with children, and Latinx women at grossly disproportionate rates because of racism, because of the racialized, housing policy and the various legacies that we live with today. So I think it's so important to come out front and say Right to Counsel is about racial justice. It's about redressing, again, not just the gross power imbalance in the courtroom, but the way that, is ripples through the community, and the way that we know eviction and housing security disproportionately impacts people of color. And I guess another thing I'll add, and I do know there's someone on this call who can speak to this expertly, but we also know that there are landlords and landlord ownership models that target communities of color, target low-income renter communities as part of their profit-making business model, because they see these groups as expendable, easy to exploit, and part of their model is to, yes, Joel, that's the one, part of the way to easily evict, flip, and make money off of poor people and off of poor people of color. So that's another way in which we see the impacts of race and racism baked into the system of housing insecurity and eviction. And so again, a right to counsel is a critical tool to have in our toolbox as we're fighting back against all of these forms of injustice. And just to add on to what Pablo said, and also I totally skipped this part. There's so much more to, of course, share. The strength in the coalition work is our ongoing, partnership and engagement of labor unions, the school, the LAUSD and teachers union, and racial justice organizing groups locally, right? We have to make this a labor issue. We have to make this a racial justice. It is a labor issue. It is a racial justice issue. It is a child welfare and health issue. It's an education issue, et cetera. And so having that super coalition and building solidarity with groups outside of, the tenant rights space is so, so important to moving this work forward.
I would just also add that what happened in DC, I was talking to an organizer, a Black tenant organizer, who's also an attorney, and he basically said what happened in DC caused him and everyone else in his community to lose faith in the justice system as a whole. And that included housing court and evictions. And he basically said, no one in my community understands why they should even bother to participate in an eviction proceeding at all. We had such a huge problem with defaults before, and what that incident did, I don't think can be overstated in terms of what the damage it did to the belief in any kind of justice system. And it really created, I think, it really clarified and made clear a lot of the work that we have to do. We already know that a lot of people don't show up because they have lost faith in the system, and that certainly did nothing to, but make that lack of faith seem absolutely right. So from our perspective, we have so much work to do when we're dealing with a system that's this broken on so many levels, even outside of the eviction court. And I don't have any answers except just that his comment about making the connection between DC and what happens in housing court was not something that I immediately thought about. And I appreciated him making that connection to help make us, or me, really aware of how we need to think about this issue in a much bigger way. I don't think I haven't anything else unless Caitlin and Pablo do.
Any last questions? Otherwise, thank you so much, John and Caitlin and Pablo, for coming and sharing.
Happy to do it, and happy to come back in a little while to report on what new jurisdictions have passed a right to counsel since this time, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having us, and please, yeah, reach out. Happy to be a resource in whatever way is helpful. And keep up all the amazing work y'all are doing.
Absolutely. Could not do it without you.
Well, thanks everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and end the call then.
Awesome. See you all.